Welcome to the Property Buyer Podcast, where we explore the world of residential and commercial real estate to help you make better decisions about buying, selling or investing in all types of property. Join me, Rich Harvey, CEO of propertybuyer.com.au and multi-award-winning buyer's advocate. Our podcast features expert interviews, market trends and insights, and practical tips for navigating the complex world of Australian real estate. Whether you're a home buyer, a seasoned property investor, commercial buyer, developer, or simply curious about the property market, our podcast is for you. Join us as we share our knowledge, strategies and experience and help you achieve your property goals. I'm Rich Harvey and welcome to another edition of the Property Buyer Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Anne Flaherty, Senior Economist from REA Group. With over a decade of experience in property economics, market analytics and forecasting, Anne is widely regarded for her clear-eyed interpretation of housing trends and her ability to translate complex data into meaningful insights for buyers, sellers, investors and policymakers. Her commentary is regularly featured across the media outlets and she plays a pivotal role in shaping REA's market outlooks, rental reports and buyer sentiment. Anne's work spans everything from macroeconomic forces like interest rates and migration trends and construction to local supply and demand patterns that influence how Australians live, rent and buy property today. Anne, it's great to have you on the Property Buyer Podcast. So, Anne, before we dive in, we just have
great to be here.
We have a little tradition with our podcast. So I'm going to throw you our thought of the day. And this thought is from Woody Allen, a famous movie producer, who said 80% of success is showing up. What do you take from that quote, Anne?
Look, I think it's probably something I should be told more often. But I think in the context of property, I think that analysis paralysis stops people taking action. I think sometimes, we worry about timing the market or maybe making the absolute right decision because it is a big decision. And sometimes that actually holds us back from doing anything at all.
Indeed. I think it's also for me, when I look at that quote, Anne, it's a lot of people kind of think, it's just too hard to, do a trade or go to uni or buy a property or do whatever. And they just kind of give up. But honestly, give it a go. As they say, the first step to success is having a go. So, yeah. And I'm curious to learn a little bit about your background, if I may. What made you want to work as an economist and also what got you interested in the entire property market?
Look, it's a bit of a funny journey in a way. Being an economist wasn't really on my initial plan, to be honest. I didn't know what I was going to do after school, but I was told that if I did a commerce degree, I would hopefully be able to get a job at the end of it. And I still remember my first economics class. I didn't know what inflation was, what GDP was. It was all foreign to me, but after studying it, I just grew to love it. But I think for me, applying economics to property was kind of inevitable because unlike economics, I've always loved and known about property. As a kid, I used to look forward to auctions on the weekend and trying to guess what the homes would sell for. So I think for me, just property is really the aspect that sort of always kind of called to me.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, it had the same sort of impact on me too. I didn't know what inflation was or how financial markets work when I went to uni. I was told the same thing. Go to job, get a good, go to uni, get a good job and you'll be set for life. But things have changed. But I found economics fascinating. It teaches me, how to think, how to research. And I remember my economics lecturer telling me, the questions are always the same each year, but the answers change. You have to keep reconstructing the models, don't we?
Yes. Exactly.
Just sort of putting our glasses on the back of our head and looking backwards, we're recording this at the end of 2025. How would you characterise the 2025 property market? What sort of things would you describe it as?
Look, I mean, if we just look at the raw numbers, it was a year where we did see property prices rise. But I think that the key things we saw impacting the market was we had interest rates decrease 3 times. They were the first drops since 2020. And I think that another really important key theme that's shaped what's happening is that continued imbalance between supply and demand, which has been stronger in some markets than others. So I know in 2024 we saw a massive disparity between how certain markets were performing versus others. In 2025, we're still seeing that disparity. Some markets are stronger than others, but that has been decreasing. And overall, we have seen all capital cities record home value increases. But of course, those stronger performing markets like Adelaide, Perth, Brisbane have continued to outpace the other markets.
Has it surprised you with the rate cuts? Has it kind of surprised you how quickly or slowly the market responded to those rate cuts we had this year?
Look, I think that the response was somewhat what was anticipated. You know, it wasn't like what we were seeing back in 2020 where we had a whole string of rate cuts very quickly, a massive drop in the cash rate. You know, by recent historical standards, interest rates are still sitting quite high. And the number of interest rate cuts that we have had is fewer than a lot of us were anticipating sort of in the earlier part of this year. So I think that even though interest rates have done a lot to increase buyer confidence, buyer demand, it hasn't had as significant an impact as it may have done in other periods where we had bigger drops.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Yeah. And if I could ask you to get out your crystal ball, you know, put on your wizard hat, please, and get your magician's wand as an economist. I'm just joking, but what's your predictions for 2026? Yep. Where do you think the market for each of the capital cities? Maybe you could just give us a little anecdote on, just where you see the market going generally, sentiment, and maybe the capital cities. What do you see going forward in 2026?
Yeah, look, we do think that property prices are going to grow across all the capitals in 2026, but we do think that that rate of growth is going to be more moderate compared to what we've seen this year. And I think that a key factor behind that is going to be interest rates. Like I mentioned a few months ago, there was a much stronger possibility that we were going to see a rate cut whether late this year or early next year, but now that's pretty much off the cards with inflation having picked back up. And I think inflation is a big risk factor there, because if we did see it pick up even further, there's even the scope for a potential rate rise, which would be a bit of a shock considering where we were 6 months ago with those interest rate expectations.
It would be, yeah. Do you have any thoughts on individual cities? Like, does REA put out any sort of predictions like Domain or like SQM research does on terms of where they think generally prices will be in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, etc.?
Yeah, we do. We produce citywide forecasts, and what we're anticipating is that in pretty much every capital, the rate of growth will be slightly below what we have seen year on year to November. The one exception to that is Melbourne. So in Melbourne, we actually think that that price growth is going to be at the level we've seen over the past year or even slightly higher. Whereas in markets like Adelaide, Perth and Brisbane, which have been very strong, we're actually anticipating that while those are going to be the three stronger performing markets next year, that rate of growth is not going to be equal to what we saw this year. Interesting.
Yeah. I've got some figures that I'll just throw at you, if I may. And I know Domain's forecast for Sydney in financial year 26 is 10%. Melbourne, they're expecting an 8% rise. Brisbane, a 10% rise. Adelaide, 8% rise. And Perth, a 6% rise. So they're pretty strong figures. But then you've got Louis Christopher from SQM. Yeah, he's putting Perth at the top of the tree. He always puts a range for his forecast. He's suggesting that Perth will do somewhere between 12 and 16%. Brisbane will do 10% to 15%. Melbourne will do 4 to 7%. Sydney 3 to 6%. Adelaide 10 to 14%. So they're, higher numbers than Domain. What are your thoughts on those predictions?
Funnily enough, ours are somewhat in the middle. We also anticipate Perth being one of the strongest performing markets, along with Brisbane. We think that Adelaide is going to start to slow down. We still think that the price growth is going to be stronger. So if I'm ranking the cities in terms of price growth, Perth and Brisbane are our sort of top picks. Then Adelaide, and then we actually have put a similar range for Sydney and Melbourne. We think they will see slightly below those other capitals. Mm-hmm. But I think the interesting thing is that with our forecasts, the ranges that we're predicting are more in line with each other than what we had seen in terms of this year and last year, where we saw massive differences in the level of growth between, say, a market like Melbourne and a market like Perth.
Yeah. It still astounds me, Anne, that you've got Sydney's median house price, well, according to Domain figures, it's about 1.75 million, and Melbourne's median house price at 1.1, which is like, virtually, 70% cheaper. It's never been that far apart, has it? Do you remember a time where the dichotomy between those two cities has been so far apart? Yeah. So I think that reversion.
Absolutely not. And I think in the case of.
Go on.
Yeah. I do think it's a pretty extraordinary difference. And when you look at how the other capitals have performed compared to Melbourne, the fact that we have a median property price in Melbourne that's now sitting below that of Adelaide and Perth and Brisbane, it's really very astounding when you compare the local economies in these markets and the rate of population growth that we see as well.
Yeah, I think it's got a groundswell of support to go a lot higher than what all the forecasts are saying myself. I think there's a big number. So I think the early adopters will do very, very well getting into that Melbourne market. Yeah. And if I may just go back, just one more question on interest rates. I'm going to hammer this one home, sorry, but interest rates are often seen as one of the most critical drivers of the property market. I don't believe I think they are a critical factor, but how do you see interest rates influencing particularly the middle to upper price brackets going into 2026 and 27?
Well, normally we see interest rates have a relatively larger impact at that higher end of the market. And that makes sense if you think about the fact that on a higher mortgage, that same percentage increase in the interest rate equates to a higher dollar amount that you're paying back. I like your point. I agree with you that interest rates aren't the factor because I think that the best example of that is what happened when we saw interest rates increase massively when inflation picked up following COVID. And we only saw a slight temporary dip in house prices before they actually rebounded and started growing again. And it all came back to the fact that there was limited supply and strong demand.
Yep.
And so I think, where there's people who are looking to buy, they'll find a way regardless of where the interest rates are sitting.
Exactly. We'll touch on that. I've got some more questions for on that in a moment, actually. And I'm curious, in your role, you obviously have access to some incredible data with REA Group, which has got such, widespread influence and insights into the market. What are some of the most intriguing trends that you're starting to see emerge from what your data you're gleaning? Like, I often ask Tim Lawless, why are listing volumes, always trending down? Why are they so low? And why do homeowners only move within 7 kilometres of their home? Tell us about, what are the range of intriguing data sets or trends that you're seeing out there?
Well, the amazing thing about our data is that we get a bit of a preview of what's going to happen in the market because we can see what people are searching for, the kinds of homes they're inquiring about. We can also see, where groups are located. So I think one of the things that we have seen is a real pickup in the number of people searching to buy. There's a lot of activity in terms of just people doing research, people making inquiries, all of these things. And it can take time to translate to actual deals done in market. But it's very interesting to see that, across all of our capital cities, year on year, search volumes are up. Another sort of interesting thing that we can see is the kinds of homes people are looking to buy as well. And I think that this is an interesting point. We often talk about supply in terms of overall number of homes coming online, being built. But we don't often talk about the fact that a lot of the kinds of homes being built don't necessarily meet the needs of the market. And I think, especially in the apartment space at the moment, we're seeing a lot of premium high-end apartments built, but we're really seeing very little searches for those kinds of properties relative to the number that are coming online. The flip side is that sort of more affordable stock is seeing very, very high levels of search activity, but not as much supply. So I think that based on our search and so our demand and our supply data, I think that there's a strong signal that more affordable end of the apartment market could outperform over the coming years, which, prior to relatively recently, that kind of asset sort of saw much slower levels of capital growth.
Interesting. Just in terms of search activity, can you give us an indication of how much it's jumped? Has it jumped 20%, 30%, 50% activity? I'm just curious to get a guide on that.
No. So year on year, depending on the market you're looking at, it's between about 5 to 10%. So Melbourne is a market that's actually seen one of the stronger year on year rises in search activity. Brisbane actually has seen flat year on year growth in search activity. However, that's from a really strong base.
Yes.
So demand was already very high in Brisbane and it's sort of remained constant. But Melbourne and also Sydney has seen that growth. Darwin's an interesting one at the moment. Darwin's really hot at the moment. We've seen a big jump in people searching. We've seen big jumps in price growth as well. So that's going to be a market to watch in 2026.
I agree with your point too, just about affordable stock and how much activity is happening in that market. And as people, as prices rise typically for freestanding homes, it often is the only option for a lot of first home buyers and some investors with a more limited budget that they can only buy apartments. And also with construction costs going up, we're starting to see a lot more people buying apartments. And I agree with you. I think that market is going to outperform its historical averages over the next few years, just driven by that cost pressure. And I've got a question for you around sort of behavioural shifts. Since COVID, that changed so many things, right? We all wanted, more space. We wanted, to work closer to home. We want lifestyle. We want a resort in our backyard, whatever, right? How have you seen any changes in long-term behavioural shifts now in how people want to live post-COVID?
I think that there's a much greater focus on what is around the property than there used to be. The proportion of Australians who are working from home has remained higher post-COVID than it was before. And I think that people are looking to, for more than just the property itself. They're increasingly focused on the amenity and the lifestyle around it. So I think, even when we look at how developers are marketing their projects, you can see that massive focus that they have on you're buying into a community. They're really selling the community as much as they're selling the property itself.
Yeah, you're really right. People want that sense of community. They don't want to feel isolated. They want to be close to the shops, close to a transport node, have good medical facilities. They want some greenery and parks. So a lot of our buyers and as buyers agents come to us and you're totally right. They don't just want the house. They want the suburb. They want that community to go with it. And often people are unaware of just how affordable some different suburbs that are just a little bit out of their scope of searching and can show up for them as well. And
exactly. And I always give the advice. Oh, sorry.
Go on. Go, please.
I was just going to say, I always give the advice to my friends when you're searching for a property, go on to MapView, because often people will search a specific suburb name, not realizing that there's a neighbouring suburb that might have a lower median that basically offers everything that you're looking for.
Yeah, really good point. It's a good idea. Change your perspective. Go to MapView. Good idea. Yeah. And we've had pretty massive migration come into Australia since COVID. I mean, we had almost 1 million people come in, in the 3 years post-COVID. How has Australia's migration profile changed, and which markets do you think have been most affected by waves of this demand?
Well, I think that the biggest impact has probably been felt in WA. If we look at the total number of homes that have been built across each state over recent years, and we compare that with how many people have moved into those states, there are some massive, massive shortfalls in terms of the total number of homes being built. And I think that in the case of WA, that's one of the key reasons that market has seen such substantial price growth. But it's not just a story in WA. look across the whole of the country, the vast, with the exception of Tasmania and Canberra, every state has seen a significant shortfall in new homes built. And even though we're seeing that the migration figures have come down from those 2023 peaks, migration is still very high, and the rate at which we're building new homes, while it's starting to pick up a bit, it isn't picking up anywhere near enough. And that the government's new housing accord, their target goal for building new homes, that if they did build all the new homes they hope to, that would keep supply relative to demand at the same levels that it was basically when that initiative kicked off. So it's not really doing anything to improve supply relative to the population growth. It's basically maintaining that balance.
Interesting. You've read my mind actually, just about this whole construction squeeze, the supply squeeze. I think it's going to be a lot greater crunch than we all anticipate. As you say, if we were to build 240,000 homes a year over the next 5 years, we're just going to then keep treading water. But we're not actually going to improve the supply position, are we? So it really is going to be constant price.
Exactly.
Are we ever going to catch up, or
exactly?
Are we ever going to have? Or are we just going to be supply constrained for decades? What's your thought? Do we have a structural inbuilt problem here?
I think that there's a structural issue here. And I think that until we can solve the issue of how can we build homes quicker, how can we approve homes quicker, this isn't going to be solved anytime soon. Perhaps new technologies that might enable homes to be built and constructed really quickly, more cheaply than they are, could be the solution here. But until those techniques sort of become more mainstream, we're really, I think, facing a situation where, we talk about housing affordability being an issue at the moment, but if we look at the path we're heading down, it seems as though it's going to become worse.
We appreciate you tuning in to the Property Buyer Podcast, and I hope that you're finding our expert interviews helpful. So that we can keep providing this information and growing our audience, we rely on word-of-mouth recommendations. If you found this information useful, could I please ask you to share this podcast with your friends, family and colleagues, and ask them to subscribe to the Property Buyer Podcast. It would be a big help, and we'd be very grateful for your support. Thanks once again for sharing the links. And now let's get back to the podcast.
A little segue here, Anne, is that I sort of want to put out to the listeners out there that are listening to this, they go, oh, well, this is just the government's problem. But if you're a savvy investor, right, and this is where my ears prick up, I go, here's a massive opportunity to get into the market and do well. If you look at Warren Buffett, and it's the way he sort of thinks about investing. I love to buy in areas which have very limited supply and very strong constant demand. And residential property is one of those markets over the next 5 to 10 years. I think we're going to see another super cycle. In other words, we're going to see price growth really outpace a lot of people's expectations. The structural issues we've got with construction, because construction costs are about 61% higher than they were ever since COVID started, and we're going to continue to have migration. We're going to continue to have, a slow build pipeline. So for me, it's a no-brainer to invest in property, and quite heavily. So do you have any thoughts on this sort of issue being an opportunity for savvy investors?
It's definitely an opportunity. And going back to that quote you started with at the beginning of the podcast, sorry, I think that, people who they're worried about timing the market, or they're worried about potentially, overpaying slightly for an investment.
Yeah.
If you think about the prospects for capital gains, I think it's worth making a move if you are in a position to do so. I think that the fundamentals are very strong in Australia right now. We tick every box. As a developing country, we have one of the fastest growing populations in the world. And the economic fundamentals of Australia are very, very good. And this issue of housing undersupply is not going away anytime soon, but we know that people need somewhere to live. I think that the rental pool is going to continue to grow. So there's absolutely so much opportunity out there.
absolutely. I'm actually preparing a quite a major report called The Great Supply Crunch that we're going to be releasing in January about this very issue. And our head of research, Haswan Arif, is helping me prepare this document. And we've interviewed a lot of people like yourself, and we're actually delving into just how serious this supply crunch is going to be, and it's going to pave the way to quite significant price increases over the next 5 years. But Anne, I want to ask you, are there any particular regions in Australia or cities where you think there's a big mismatch between demand for housing and also the supply of new housing as we go over the next 5 to 10 years?
Honestly, the answer that I was going to say is it's almost a universal issue at this point. I think Melbourne is one where if we look at the demographic of Melburnians, they tend to on average be a bit younger than the other capitals. There's a lot of job opportunities in Melbourne. The cost of living in terms of housing is much lower. But those sort of more affordable entry price points are becoming fewer and fewer. And I think that once Melbourne especially picks up its growth, that's going to become an issue. And at the moment, because that price growth in Melbourne has been slower, we actually have seen less of a pickup in development activity in Melbourne compared to what we're seeing in the other capitals. So that's one market I'd highlight. I think another opportunity could be those larger regional markets where they have strong local economies. We're not seeing sufficient housing being constructed, but a lot of these are areas where people they may move to these areas because they're priced out of living within the capital city itself, and they're looking for somewhere else to live where they can buy a home at a lower price, find a job. And I think, a classic example of that more recently is somewhere like Townsville. And I think that kind of opportunity is there as well. So it's worth having a think about, what are Australia's sort of major hubs? So it don't have to be capital cities, but also regional hubs.
Really good point. It's interesting you mentioned Townsville because we're actively buying there for our clients and getting fantastic results, but buying there is very competitive. Any property that comes on the market is snapped up within 1 to 2 weeks if you can get your hands on it. So a very active market.
Wow.
Yeah. So and also you've also got a big defence personnel increase. I think there's over 500 defence force and their families trying to find a home in that area as well. So, yeah. And it's interesting you mentioned regional markets. I think Newcastle, Central Coast and places like Geelong are also are going to really see a boost in demand for those people that can't quite afford to live in the major capitals as well. What do you think of those areas?
I agree completely. I think that, especially if you look at Geelong, actually the travel time between Geelong and the Melbourne CBD is less than some suburban locations in Greater Melbourne. And it offers a better lifestyle in terms of, you're close by the water. There's tons and tons of amenity in both Geelong and Newcastle. So inevitably, those are markets that I think with the lower entry price point, the high quality of life, the great amenity, they tick all the boxes in terms of people wanting to live in those areas and home prices growing in those areas.
Okay. Excellent. You mentioned demographics before. Can I just sort of delve into your brain a bit here, if I may? Again, just because you would see, I guess, what sort of types of buyers are buying, I hope, from your data. So I'm talking about the different kind of cohorts. So your downsizer, your first home buyer, your expat, your investor, your upgrader. Who do you think is going to be the most active buyer group in the next year or so in 2026?
I think one thing that could be interesting to watch is the new migrant groups. We had extremely strong levels of international migration into Australia that sort of started to kick off in 2022, really picked up in 2023. And we know that these people, it's often around 5 years on average when they sort of maybe start to think about that buying journey. 5 to 10 years. So I think it'll be really interesting to see whether this results in a wave of buyer demand. We saw that wave of renter demand, of course, with that stronger migration. But I think that's one to watch, especially given if we look at, the top sources of migration. I think India's sitting at the number one spot. And we actually do a lot of work in terms of what different groups are looking for in the sorts of homes that they want to buy. Things like multi-generational living, which are more common in some cultures than others. Things like, acceptance of raising a family in an apartment for people who come from other places where apartment living is the norm. So I think it's not just the, number of people, but I think looking at the countries that are driving migration is going to frame, I think, the kinds of homes that are in demand.
Interesting. Do you think expats are going to sort of make any kind of resurgence in 2026, given where like the Aussie dollar is sitting around roughly, I think, 64 cents USD? I think, often they've got better buying power. Like we service a lot of clients coming out of Singapore, Hong Kong and other countries. But do you think expats are going to make a bit of a surgence or not?
I think that there's fantastic opportunities for expats, to be honest. And having just come back from travelling myself, I've never felt so poor. The Australian dollar is not not great for those of us here, but for those who have been working in other countries, their relative buying power has increased compared to locals here. So there's a bit of an edge there that I think some expats are going to take advantage of.
Yeah, very good. And the first home buyer, the 5% deposit scheme, that's had, in my view, a very significant impact on the market. My team right across Australia, like in Western Sydney, we're seeing 100 groups lining up to go through a property. In Brisbane, we're seeing a dramatic increase in the numbers, same in Melbourne. How effective is this sort of first home buyer scheme in actually accelerating first home ownership? Or do you think it's just pulling forward demand and putting fuel on the fire?
I think my answer is going to be a bit mixed. I think in some, I would say that it is pulling forward demand. It's pushing property prices up. On the flip side, it is going to help some people get into the market sooner. So I'm not going to say that it's all bad as a policy. However, I think that as a policy, it's really not tackling the issue of why it is so hard to buy a first home. And, if you just think about how much demand has increased in that cohort and where that demand is sitting, it has to sit within those price thresholds. That's really, going to be just driving stronger price growth within those price thresholds over, it's started already and it'll continue into next year as well.
I find it fascinating. I mean, you'd appreciate this as an economist too. You look at the Treasury modelling that was done when they promoted this scheme. I mean, both sides of government were guilty of promoting it, in my view, but they estimated a 0.6% increase in property prices as a result of this scheme. I think that far underestimates the impact and also the timing of when they've brought this scheme in. They actually brought it in October instead of bringing it in 2026. So they brought it forward like, 3 to 6 months. So I think the modelling was way out. Do you?
I mean, we laughed, to be honest, when we saw the 0.6%. It is laughable. I don't understand where that number could possibly come from when you think about how much more accessible it is as a first home buyer now. And, even from the bank's perspective, from a lending perspective, there's no chance that it's going to be anything like as low as 0.6.
No, that's right. Exactly. I mean, there's articles in today's paper saying the banks are way behind because of their processing times are blown out by the number of people that are applying for it and taking advantage of it. And I just think it's going to push forward all of those price caps. Like in Sydney, it's 1.5, in Melbourne, $1 million, Brisbane, $1 million. It's going to push the prices toward the caps much, much faster than anticipated. So, and I want to ask you again about the affordability challenge. Do you think Australia's affordability challenge can be solved without major planning reforms? Why or why not?
Not without major reforms, no. I think we're in a situation now where affordability is at such low levels that unless something fundamentally shifts, we're not going to see a turnaround. I think we're already in a situation where there's enormous inequality because of property ownership. Those who are in the market who, are looking to buy, who can sell a home or can use the equity that they've gained compared to someone who is looking to get into the market for the first time. It's an extraordinary disadvantage if you don't have that support of already being in the market or maybe family support. So I think this has to be a major shift. Something big has to change to ensure that we're building enough homes at an affordable price point for people to get on the ladder.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think there's so much to be done. Is there any particular, if you were suddenly made federal minister for housing tomorrow, the Honourable Anne Flaherty, what policy would you introduce tomorrow to kind of improve housing outcomes if you could wave a magic wand?
Honestly, in terms of policy, I'm not too sure, but I would love to see massive investment into new construction techniques. If we look at how much the cost to build has increased in recent years, and there are technologies that are emerging in other countries, whether it's something like a 3D printed home or prefab, I think that's really an opportunity. If we can find a way of building homes more cheaply, more quickly, also being realistic about where people want to live, opening up, releasing new land, or all of these things, even things around local council planning. There's so many levels on which we can alleviate a lot of the main barriers to supply. And, all of them really need to be tackled.
Yeah, really good points there, Anne. I agree with you 100% on construction technology. In fact, a lot of the banks are now giving much more acceptance to modular construction and really accepting that as a valid way of building. And I think that'll be a very much a significant way forward. As to council policies and local government, we're starting to see some of that happen across, certainly in Sydney. I know the LMR, the low to medium residential density zonings have been increased within 800 metres of transport centres and community shopping centres where you can do townhouses and up to 3-storey apartment blocks now. So, but again, they're great initiatives, but it's going to take a long while for it to filter through because, I'm even looking at doing feasibility myself right now, and it's taking considerable time to get the funding, to do the planning. Everything takes time. So any sort of person out there thinking a politician's going to be a saviour, it's not one person. It's going to have to be across all sectors of government and a lot of people pulling together. And I think a lot of people like to point the blame at like native gearing or CGT discounts or one particular tax policy as being the major problem. But it's not. They're all just interlinked. And I think just changing one thing in isolation is not going to solve our housing crisis.
No, absolutely not. I think people love to point at these taxes as something that is making the market unaffordable. But when you look at the actual stats, it comes down to how many homes we have. And that point you make about feasibilities is so important because just because you can build a block of 3-storey apartments doesn't mean that it's feasible to do so until we can have a situation where the developers can actually make a reasonable profit on these kinds of developments. They're not going to be built even if they're allowed to be. Yeah,
we're going to get into a really good discussion here, Anne, because a lot of people see developers as evil, greedy developers, but it's the economic reality of our society and the economy is that you can't get the thing built unless it's feasible. Like, who in their right mind would go and build a 3-storey walk-up if you're going to lose $1 million? No one is, right? And often we point the finger at, particularly the Chinese developers that used to come in, particularly during sort of the 2010 to 2015 period, as being a problem for our housing market. I've got to say, in actual fact, they were the saviour for a lot of our housing market. They actually imported a lot of supply, which was great for our market. So, I think there's a lot of kind of myths that need to be busted right across this sector to show how we can all work together to get a better outcome for the property market. And I want to ask you about property
Definitely
investors.
Agree.
Are you seeing any trends amongst property investors? Are they running away from the market, retreating? Are they returning, or are they reshaping their strategies? What are you seeing in sort of the mindset of the investor at the moment?
We're seeing investors more active than they were. And one market, again, we've talked about Melbourne a fair bit today, but I think that we've seen a bit of a turnaround in Melbourne whereby we had investors absolutely fleeing the Melbourne market, very high taxes, a lot of compliance. But if you look at the sort of prospects for capital growth in Melbourne now, investors are more willing to bear the burden of the higher taxes, the higher compliance, if there's stronger prospects for capital growth.
Exactly.
So I think that's one market that's seen a bit of a shift. I think, generally speaking, Brisbane has been attracting more investor activity for quite some years, and we're still seeing that. We're still seeing a lot of investors looking to get into the Brisbane market. I think a lot of people are very excited about the prospect of the Olympics, raising the profile of the city. The fundamentals there are pretty strong. And I think actually Brisbane's a market where the supply issues could potentially become worse because of the Olympics, which is going to drive up demand for construction workers to be working on those Olympic-related projects and leave less labour available for home construction. So I think that's a market that's going to remain pretty strong with investors as well. And I think markets where we have a more affordable entry point, with strong yields, good local renter demand, places like Darwin, for example. I think one of the reasons that market has been outperforming is investors are looking at the yields. They're looking at the shortage of housing and saying, hang on, that's an opportunity here without as big of an investment outlay initially. Those kinds of markets, I think, are continuing to see pretty strong interest.
Yeah, I agree with you very much about Melbourne and Brisbane. We're actively buying in both those markets, and particularly the Brisbane market's got a really good runway for both growth and yield. Very low vacancy, like 0.9% vacancy rate there. And, what we were buying at, $750 last year, we're spending $850 now, and it's just jumped up significantly. And I think that's going to continue because of the supply shortages going forward. Yeah. And if I may ask you just a little bit more of a data question, I'm just going to tap into your economist brain again. Is there kind of a really misunderstood piece of data that causes buyers and sellers to just misread or misinterpret the market? Is there something they constantly trip over that you'd like to point out to our listeners?
Ooh, there's probably a few. The first one I might speak to could be auction clearance rates.
Yes.
I often hear people make conclusions about what's happening in a market because, the clearance may have dropped over the weekend. But I think it's really important to remember that, most homes don't sell via auction. It's only a very small subset of the market. And, you can see really quite significant discrepancies between the clearance rate from one weekend to the next. So I think, sure, it's helpful to look at the overall longer-term trend of auction clearance rates, but not get too distracted by what happens week on, week out.
Yeah, I agree. I think auction, there's too much credence placed on it. Is there any other piece of data that you think is one to trip people up?
I think the headline price growth data that, we see reported in the media, which makes sense. The media is always writing on, it's writing stories that relate to as many people as possible. But often people have a sense of, the capital city I'm living in, I read that values are up or down X percent, therefore my home is up X or down X percent.
Yep.
And I think remembering that every suburb is its own market, and you can have wildly different trends between suburbs. And that is something that people really need to remember, that just because, they're reading about prices moving in a certain direction doesn't necessarily mean that where they're looking to buy or sell is following those trends.
I totally agree. Often median prices is one that gets me as well. Like you'll see, particularly in high value suburbs like East Sydney's East, like Bellevue Hill, where the median is like 9 or 10 million. And then you'll see a headline saying, the East, Bellevue Hills dropped 30%, and that's because there's hardly been any transactions that year.
Oh, yes.
And they've all sold for like 5 or 6 million instead of 10 million, right? And then you look at other suburbs that have risen like 38%, and that's suddenly because they've got a massive volume, So, you've got to be very careful when you're comparing median house price numbers. And again, as you say, it's delve into the data at a very hyper-localized level is what makes it very important. Yeah. This has been great.
Absolutely.
I've only a couple more questions before I can let you go for the day. But if we're looking ahead like 5 years, what excites you most about the evolution of the Australian housing market, and equally, what concerns you the most?
In terms of what excites me, I think that we're seeing a greater variety of property types being built, even things like the build-to-rent sector, which basically, I remember when the first build-to-rent project was announced, and we were wondering, is this going to be a thing in Australia like it is in other countries? I think giving buyers more choice, even things like co-living, I think that there's a lot of opportunity to get creative with how buying a home looks, what that home looks like. And I think even technological advancements as well in the way we build. And I'm not just talking about cost savings, but also making homes more efficient. We know that these kinds of things can save homeowners a lot of money in the long run, increase their comfort in their homes. So I think that's one positive. What concerns me really is what we were speaking about earlier, and that is how long is it going to take before we see a turnaround in how we can supply enough new housing to meet the needs of our growing population, and not just enough housing, but the right kind of homes in the right locations to make sure that, not just our people, but also our economies operating as efficiently as possible. It's actually a massive inefficiency when people are forced to live far away from where they work or far away from where their children can go to school.
Yes.
So making sure that people are sort of plugged into locations where they have access to everything that they need, their places of work.
Yep, I agree. But here's my plug: get rid of stamp duty, bring back land tax, improve mobility in the property market, improve turnover. Any politicians listening to this, here's the answers. It's all on the Propertybuyer Podcast. There you go. And I've just got one last question.
The one thing all economists agree on.
Exactly.
Sorry, I just said the one thing all economists agree.
Yeah, love that. And for all the aspiring home buyers and investors out there, is there one piece of property advice, or what's the best piece of property advice that you've ever heard or maybe received yourself that you'd happy to share with our audience today?
I think I know a lot of my generation often feel as though it's not possible to get in, and I think that that's really a lie. I think that there is opportunity out there, and I think that explore your options, talk to brokers, don't rule yourself out from buying. Look at how prices vary around the country in different locations. Maybe buying an investment rather than a home you live in as your first step into the market is the way to go. But I think resetting the mindset of it's not impossible, it's definitely possible.
Love that. That is a fantastic answer. I love the reset the mindset. That's such a great answer, Anne. I've been chatting with Anne Flaherty, REA Senior Economist. Anne, thank you so much for your thoughts and insights today. It's truly been excellent, and I just want to say thank you very much today.
Well, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, great. Look, thank you, everybody.
Thanks for being with us on another Property Buyer podcast. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please click on the SpeakPipe link and we'll answer this during the next episode. If you're looking to buy a residential or commercial property in the near future and would like to get the added advantage of having a buyer's advocate on your side, then please reach out to my team today and send us your inquiry, and we'd be delighted to help. Please visit our website at propertybuyer.com.au, where you can stay updated with all my latest market updates, weekly blogs and live suburb profiles to help you make better property decisions. We look forward to connecting with you again on the next Property Buyer podcast.